Growing up, I always knew I was the second choice. My name is Diana, and I was born 5 years after my sister Nellie, the apple of my parents' eye. From my earliest memories, the difference in how we were treated was as clear as day. "Mom, can I get new shoes for school? These ones have holes," I'd ask, shuffling my feet in worn-out sneakers. "Diana, we just bought you shoes last year. They're fine," Mom would dismiss me without even looking up from whatever she was doing for Nellie. Meanwhile, my sister would breeze in and casually mention, "Those new boots at the mall are cute," and the next day, they'd somehow appear in her room. It was just how things worked in our house. I remember one particular morning when I was 12 and Nellie was 17. She was sprawled on the couch, texting on her brand new phone, a just because gift from our parents. "I don't want to go to college," Nellie announced during breakfast. "It's pointless and boring. I'd rather just stay home." Mom nearly dropped her coffee cup. "But honey, what about your future?" "Well," Dad started cautiously, "we were planning to pay for any college you choose. Even if it's in another state." I watched as Nellie's entire demeanor changed in an instant. She sat up straight, suddenly very interested. "Wait, any college? Even one far away from here?" "Of course, sweetheart," Mom jumped in. "We want what's best for you." In that case, Nellie's eyes lit up with excitement. "I want to go to Pacific State. It's perfect, and it's 3 states away." The prospect of escaping our parents' supervision had suddenly made college very appealing to her. I sat there, pushing my cereal around in my bowl, already knowing that when my time came, the conversation would be very different. But I had my own plans. While Nellie coasted through high school with mediocre grades and an active social life, I buried myself in my studies. It wasn't just about proving something, it was about survival. The next few years passed in a blur of textbooks and part-time jobs. I watched as Nellie left for college with a fully paid tuition and a new wardrobe, while I saved every dollar I earned from babysitting and tutoring younger kids. My sister's phone calls home became less frequent, but when they came, they were full of stories about parties and boys, never about classes or grades. Then came the call that changed everything. I was 16 when Nellie called home in tears, 3 months into her 3rd year. She was pregnant, and the father wasn't in the picture, a phrase I'd hear repeated countless times in the coming years. "You need to come home right away," Mom said into the phone, her voice thick with concern. "We'll help you through this. You can stay here with us, and we'll take care of everything." A few months after Nellie's return, our house was filled with the sounds of a newborn baby. She gave birth to a boy, and just like that, my parents had a grandson to dote on. Nellie settled into a routine of staying home all day with the baby, showing zero interest in finding work or finishing her degree. "I'm a full-time mom now," she'd say proudly whenever anyone brought up the subject of working. "That's the most important job in the world." Meanwhile, I'd been burning the midnight oil, studying harder than ever. My efforts paid off when I got accepted to the local community college with a partial scholarship. I remember practically skipping into the kitchen that morning, acceptance letter in hand, thinking I'd finally made things easier for everyone. "Mom, Dad, look." I waved the letter excitedly. "I got a partial scholarship. You'll only need to pay half of the tuition. Isn't that great?" The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged that look I'd grown to dread over the years. "Diana," Mom said slowly, not quite meeting my eyes, "we haven't planned to help with your college education at all." I felt like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. "What? But, you paid for Nellie's entire tuition." "That was different," Mom cut me off. "Right now, we need to support Nellie and the baby. She's a single mother with no help from the father. All our money is going to her and your nephew." My hand started shaking. "Okay, then maybe we could take out a student loan? I promise I'll pay back every penny with interest once I start working." "Absolutely not," Dad spoke up, his voice firm. "In fact, there's something else we need to discuss. It's time for you to move out." I thought I must have misheard him. "Move out? Why?" We've decided to give your room to your nephew, he continued. He needs his own space as he grows up. But where am I supposed to go? My voice came out as a whisper. I can't afford to pay for college and rent an apartment. Please, just let me stay here while I study. Diana, Mom's voice turned cold, you're 18 now. An adult. It's time you took care of yourself. The room situation is non-negotiable. Then, with a gesture I'll never forget, my mother pointed to the door. I spent that night walking aimlessly through the neighborhood, my mind racing with panic and possibilities. Then, like a light cutting through fog, I remembered Sarah. We'd been friends since middle school, and she'd always been there for me. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called her. Sarah lived in a beautiful apartment downtown, a graduation gift from her wealthy parents. When I arrived, she was waiting at the entrance, still in her pajamas. She took one look at my tear-stained face and pulled me into a tight hug. You're staying with me, she declared, leading me inside. For as long as you need. No arguments. The next morning, Sarah called her parents and asked them to come over. I tried to protest, but she wouldn't hear it. They'll want to help, Diana, just let them. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson arrived within the hour. They listened intently as I reluctantly shared my story, trying to keep my voice steady. This is unacceptable, Mr. Anderson said when I finished, his face red with anger. No parent should treat their child this way. Sarah, your mother, and I will pay for Diana's education. I started to shake my head. No, please, I couldn't. You don't need to pay it back, Mr. Anderson added. Consider it an investment in a bright young woman's future. But I couldn't accept that. I appreciate it more than I can say, but I need to pay it back, please. It would mean everything to have your help, but I want to earn it. They exchanged glances, and Mr. Anderson nodded with what looked like respect. I wrote out a formal receipt right then and there, my hand trembling slightly as I signed it. The next few days passed in a blur of adjustment and new routines. One evening, I saw a recruitment ad in the cafe near the campus. I told Sarah about this, and she unexpectedly replied that we should apply together. I was surprised. Sarah had never worked before, she'd never needed to. So we applied, and to our delight, we both got hired. Working together turned out to be more fun than either of us expected. We'd come home exhausted but laughing, smelling like coffee, and sharing stories about difficult customers. One Sunday, during our regular dinner at her parents' house, Mrs. Anderson pulled me aside. I need to thank you, Diana, she said softly. Sarah's different now, more responsible, more independent. Before you moved in, she never thought about working or managing her own money. Now she hasn't asked us for extra cash in months. She's growing up, and I think a lot of that is because of your influence. That's not because of me, I protested. Sarah's always been amazing. Mr. Anderson joined us, smiling. True, but you've shown her a different way of looking at things. You know what she told me yesterday? She said she's proud of earning her own spending money. Or Sarah, proud of working at a cafe. It was a damn nice confession. Community college might not have had the prestige of State University where Nellie had dropped out, but I was determined to make the most of it. I threw myself into every opportunity one could find, academic competitions, student leadership programs, extra credit projects. Anything that could help me stand out. The state business competition had been a turning point. I'd stayed up for 3 nights straight preparing my presentation on sustainable business practices. When they announced my name as the state winner, I couldn't believe it. Ms. Reynolds, the dean called me to his office a week later. Congratulations on your victory. The college has decided to offer you a full scholarship for the remainder of your studies. That evening, I called Sarah with the news. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. We have to celebrate, she insisted. Mom, Dad. Diana got a full scholarship. The Andersons insisted on hosting a dinner in my honor. Their house had become more of a home to me than my parents' house ever was. Every Christmas, every holiday, they made sure I knew I had a place at their table. To Diana, Mr. Anderson raised his glass at dinner. We always knew you could do it. Even with the full scholarship, I kept my cafe job. Sarah had moved on to other things, but I enjoyed the work and the extra income. Every dollar I saved felt like another brick in the foundation of my future. Graduation day came faster than I expected. As I stood in my cap and gown, I searched the crowd and found the Andersons beaming at me. My own parents and sister weren't there, and honestly, I preferred it that way. I hadn't spoken to them since the day they kicked me out, and I had no desire to change that. Diana, Mr. Anderson caught up with me after the ceremony. I've mentioned you to some colleagues at Jensen Corporation. They're very interested in meeting you. Thanks to his recommendation, I landed a position in their project management team. The salary was enough for me to rent my own apartment, nothing fancy, but it was mine. Every month, I set aside money to repay the Andersons, despite their continued protests. I threw myself into work with the same dedication I'd shown in college. There was a particularly challenging project that nobody wanted to touch, a complete overhaul of our client management system. I volunteered. For 6 months, I lived and breathed that project. Late nights, endless meetings, countless revisions. But in the end, we didn't just succeed, we exceeded every target. The new system increased client retention by 40% and brought in millions in additional revenue. 2 years after starting at Jensen Corp., I handed Mr. Anderson a check for the full amount of my tuition, including interest. You didn't have to do this, he said softly. Yes, I did, I replied. You believed in me when no one else would. But I needed to do this on my own. A week later, I was called into the CEO's office. I thought it was about the client management project, and in a way, it was. Diana, she said, we're creating a new department to handle strategic client relationships, based on the success of your system overhaul. We want you to head it. At 25, I became the youngest department head in the company's history. The salary increase was substantial, more money than I'd ever dreamed of making at this age. As I sat in my new office, looking out over the city, I couldn't help but smile. I'd done it, and I'd done it on my own terms. I decided to celebrate my promotion with a small party at my apartment. Nothing too fancy, just close friends and a few cousins I'd stayed in touch with over the years. Sarah helped me arrange everything, just like she always did for special occasions. The food's amazing, my cousin Rachel said, helping herself to another appetizer. You've really made it, Diana. This apartment is gorgeous. The evening was going perfectly. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson were chatting with my work colleagues, wine was flowing, and laughter filled every corner of my home. I was in the middle of telling a funny story about my first day as department head when the doorbell rang. I'll get it, I said, assuming it was the late delivery I'd been expecting. The moment I opened the door, my blood ran cold. There stood my parents and Nellie, with her 7-year-old son hiding behind her legs. 7 years. 7 years since I'd last seen them, and here they were on my doorstep. Well, Mom pushed past me into the apartment, Dad and Nellie following close behind. Aren't you going to welcome your family? I stood frozen, my hand still on the door handle. How had they found me? Then I caught Rachel's guilty expression across the room, and I knew. One of my cousins must have told them about the party. What kind of daughter throws a party and doesn't invite her own parents? Mom's voice carried across the now silent room. We had to hear about it from others. Finding my voice, I straightened my spine. There's no reason why I would invite you. You made it clear years ago that we weren't family anymore. Don't be ridiculous. Mom waved her hand dismissively. We're your closest relatives. Of course we should be here. Before I could respond, they were pushing their way toward the dining area. Mom spotted Mr. Anderson sitting at the table and marched right up to him. Excuse me, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I need that seat. I'm Diana's mother, her beloved mother. The room fell silent. Mr. Anderson looked at me, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats as my family squeezed themselves into spaces that didn't exist. Then Mom began her performance. She stood up, wine glass in hand, though no one had offered her any. "Everyone here is celebrating my daughter's success," she announced grandly. "Well, as her mother, I deserve congratulations too. Look at her, a department head at just 25. She gestured around my apartment with sweeping arms. This luxurious apartment, that expensive car in the parking lot, the huge salary increase she just got. I watched in horror as she continued, her voice growing louder with each statement. How did she even know these details about my life? And yet, her voice suddenly turned bitter. With all this success, she doesn't help her own parents. Not a penny. Before I could respond, Nellie jumped in, pulling her son closer to her side for dramatic effect. You should see how we live, everyone, she said, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. My poor boy, I can barely afford his school supplies. Meanwhile, my sister lives like a queen, has everything handed to her on a silver platter. She's forgotten where she came from, forgotten her own family. I felt something snap inside me. 7 years of built-up anger and hurt came rushing to the surface. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Enough, my voice cut through the room like a knife. You want to talk about family? Let's talk about family. Why don't you tell everyone the real reason I haven't spoken to you in 7 years? Mom's face paled slightly, but she kept her chin high. Dad suddenly became very interested in his shoes. Tell them how you kicked your 18-year-old daughter out of the house, I continued, my voice steady despite my shaking hands. Tell them how I came to you with a partial scholarship, asking for help with the other half of my tuition, the same tuition you fully paid for Nellie, and you refused. Diana, Dad started, but I wasn't finished. Tell them how you gave away my room, before I even had a chance to find somewhere else to live. Tell them how you said you'd done enough by raising me until I was 18. Tell everyone here how you left your younger daughter homeless, because you decided your older daughter's lifestyle choices were more important. The room was dead silent. Even Nellie's son had stopped fidgeting, sensing the tension in the air. After treatment like that, I said, looking directly at my mother, what child would want to maintain a relationship with their parents? Nellie jumped up, her face red. Oh, poor Diana. Always the victim. Meanwhile, I'm raising a child alone. You've been raising a child alone in our parents' house for 7 years, I cut her off. Your son is 7 now, old enough for school. There's nothing stopping you from getting a job and helping our parents yourself. You don't understand what it's like to be a mother, Nellie spat back. You're just a careerist who only cares about herself. You don't know what it means to take care of a child 24/7. Get out. My voice was quiet but firm. All of you, get out of my apartment right now. That's when Mom's expression changed to something calculated and cold. She smiled, a smile that sent chills down my spine. Oh, we'll leave, she said slowly, but don't think you're getting rid of us that easily. We're going to sue you. What? I felt like I'd been slapped. Your father and I are sick, she continued, her voice dripping with false fragility. We're low income, struggling to make ends meet. The court will side with us, they'll force you to pay for our maintenance. After all, what kind of child abandons their elderly, ill parents when they're making so much money? The room started spinning. I felt a hand on my shoulder, Sarah, steady as always. Through the haze, I saw Mr. Anderson already pulling out his phone. Diana, he said quietly, I know an excellent lawyer who specializes in family disputes. Let me make a call right now. The weeks leading up to the trial were a nightmare of harassment. My parents called repeatedly, trying different tactics each time. Diana, let's handle this like a family, Mom would say, her voice sickly sweet. Just agree to $2,000 a month, and we can avoid all this unpleasantness. Each time, I hung up without a word. Then my cousin Rachel called, sounding worried. Diana, you need to know what's happening, she said. Your parents are going around to all the relatives, telling this sob story about how they're destitute and their ungrateful daughter abandoned them. They even convinced Aunt Martha to give them a huge sum for their lawyer. They're playing the vulnerable elderly parents card to everyone who'll listen. Despite their attempts at pressure, the lawsuit moved forward. The first court session was set for a Tuesday morning. I sat beside my lawyer, Mr. Patterson, watching my parents put on their performance. Your Honor, their lawyer began, we have two elderly parents here, struggling with health issues and limited income. Their daughter, he gestured toward me, has achieved significant financial success. We're requesting monthly support of $4,000. I felt my stomach drop. $4,000 a month would cripple me financially, despite my recent promotion. Mr. Patterson squeezed my arm reassuringly. If I may, Your Honor, he stood up, straightening his tie. I'd like to point out something that the plaintiffs seem to have conveniently forgotten. They have two children, not one. The courtroom went quiet. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. If they're claiming they raised both daughters equally, Mr. Patterson continued, then surely both daughters bear equal responsibility for their parents' care. Therefore, on behalf of my client, I move to have any awarded support split equally between both sisters. That would be $2,000 each. The reaction was immediate. Nellie shot up from her seat like she'd been electrocuted. No, she shrieked. You can't make me pay anything. I'm a single mother, I can't work. Order in the court, the judge warned, but Nellie was beyond control. This is ridiculous, she continued ranting. I'll tell you the truth, they're lying. Mom and Dad have plenty of savings. There's nothing wrong with their health either. My parents' faces had turned ghostly white. They just wanted easy money when they found out Diana was making good money now, Nellie spat out. They have enough to live on, more than enough. They just thought they could guilt her into supporting all of us. The judge's expression had transformed from stern to incredulous as he listened to Nellie's outburst. He removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. In all my years on the bench, he said slowly, I have never seen such a blatant attempt to manipulate the court or such arrogant behavior from parents toward their child. He looked directly at my parents. You should be ashamed of yourselves. Case dismissed. The gavel came down with a final, satisfying crack. The evening after the trial, I sat in my apartment, still processing everything that had happened. Sarah brought over a bottle of wine and watched as I typed out a long social media post. The post was simple and factual, just a straightforward account of what had happened in court, including Nellie's outburst and the revelation about my parents' true financial situation. Within hours, my phone was buzzing constantly with messages from relatives and friends. Diana, I had no idea, my cousin Rachel wrote. We all believed their story about being destitute. I'm so sorry. Aunt Martha was particularly furious. She'd shown up at my parents' house the very next day, demanding the return of the money she'd given them for their lawyer. You lied to me, I heard she'd shouted loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. You said you were struggling to afford food, and all this time you had savings? I want every penny back, or I'll file fraud charges. My parents had no choice but to repay her. One by one, relatives began distancing themselves from my parents. Family gatherings became awkward affairs, with most people making excuses not to attend if my parents were going to be there. About a month after the trial, Rachel called with more news. You won't believe what happened, she said. Nellie and your parents had a huge fight. Apparently, they blamed her for ruining their case with her outburst in court. She packed up her son's things and moved out. She's staying with some friend from high school. And get this, she actually got a job at the supermarket. First real job of her life. I couldn't help but laugh. How's she handling that? Oh, she's all over social media complaining about it. You don't know how hard it is to work 8 hours a day. My feet hurt. The customers are so rude. Someone should tell her that's just called being an adult. Life settled into a new normal after that. I focused on my career, my real friends, and the relatives who had shown their true colors, the good ones. The Andersons remained my chosen family, with Sarah's mom still insisting I come over every Sunday for dinner. Sometimes I hear updates about my parents and Nellie through the family grapevine. Mom and Dad largely keep to themselves now. Their social circle dramatically shrunk after their scheme was exposed. Nellie's still at the supermarket, still complaining, but at least she's supporting herself and her son for the first time in her life. As for me, I'm doing better than ever. My department is thriving, I've got a solid group of friends, and enough supportive family members to make holidays warm and wonderful. Looking back on everything that's happened, I realize that losing my biological family forced me to create something better, a chosen family built on love, respect, and genuine support. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way.